Delta Force Hawk Ops is making waves as it ramps up to become a top competitor to the Battlefield franchise, and it's made me want to take a trip down memory lane and see where it all began. Well, sort of. I went back to the most iconic game in the Delta Force franchise, Delta Force Black Hawk Down, the game based on the movie that the new game is also based on. Basically, the new game's single player is a remake of this game, and it's been 20 years since I played it, so let's get back into it and check it out. Now, loading up this, well, frankly, ancient game, I was reminded of just how brutal and, well, somewhat primitive the early years of tactical shooters were. Delta Force was very well regarded for its time, thanks to its extremely large-scale maps and being one of a handful of games that explored the more realistic tactical combat. It utilized some pretty special engine technology where the terrain was actually rendered with voxels and polygons were used for everything else. This let the developers make absolutely massive levels and put you into firefights where enemies could be 20, 50 meters away, no problem. The franchise was also notable for using projectile physics for bullets, which was really uncommon at that time, so your shots would actually have drop and travel time to them. The enemies were on the more challenging side as well. There were more strict mission parameters with time limits and no checkpoints. If you died in the middle of a mission without a quick save to load, well, you basically starting over. Now these days you're going to find more hardcore games like that, but even in 2003 this was a pretty radical style. And that's saying a lot considering just how stacked 2003 was for FPS gaming. It was the year that Call of Duty 1 launched after all, and Battlefield 1942 had just launched a year prior to that. So things were really popping off for the tactical FPS. But Delta Force was holding its own, giving gamers a more authentic FPS experience. The Black Hawk Down game was notable for being based on the original book that inspired the Ridley Scott film. It was also the first multi-platform title in the franchise. Prior to this, Delta Force was primarily a PC game. It had previously only had one release on PlayStation called Urban Warfare back in 2002, but Black Hawk Down was released on Windows, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Mac, so it was many gamers' first introduction to this franchise. Now, actually playing it once again, I gotta say the gameplay and graphics are kind of a mixed bag, where the gameplay is the strong suit and the graphics not so much. Black Hawk Down's combat, its weapon handling, its mission design, holds up surprisingly well. The way the game renders weapon sights is actually really accurate to how they look in real life, and weapons themselves are pinpoint accurate with convincing recoil and sound design, unlike honestly a lot of modern games. There's no hand holding or yellow paint pointing you in the right direction either. The minimap shows you where to go, but that's pretty much the only guidance you're going to get in the otherwise open and somewhat non-linear maps. While playing through the missions, I was honestly surprised that I could flank around buildings so freely to take enemies by surprise or find an alternate route around snipers and machine gun emplacements. This just isn't quite as common in modern games where they want you to walk a very specific path and go through a very specific sequence of events. Delta Force was like, nah, we'll just make a big map and you can approach things how you want to. It's also really impressive just how much variety of combat is in every single mission. One mission will start you in a helicopter getting dropped off on the outskirts of a desert town, then you'll take a ride in the back of a truck to a minefield while being harassed by enemy technicals, and after the minefield is a river crossing with crocodiles before you link up with another unit to assault a village. Then in another mission it has you jumping into the sea from a helicopter to acquire a rib boat and use that to assault the base, and all of these scenarios happen in a seamless, unbroken experience with no loading screens or breaks in the action. It would be an impressive sequence in any game, let alone a game that came out back in 2003. And then of course there's the actual Black Hawk Down mission that has you escorting a convoy as you take sniper fire from buildings and face an overwhelming assault from enemy fighters. This mission still makes me giddy. It's really well done. All the chatter between soldiers and command feels straightforward and realistic to how it would have been in real life. The civilians mix in with the enemy combatants, making target selection difficult. control, and the civilians will even attack you if you get too close. Now, sadly, and as you can see, the visuals don't impress as much as the game design. The levels have that classic early 2000s barren landscape look with rudimentary buildings that repeat themselves all over the place, and it's really obvious. The character models are blocky and animated with very stiff and lifeless actions, and it's also kind of frustrating that the game arguably looks better on the PlayStation 2 than the PC version, with more atmospheric lighting, more props, decoration to the levels, and more civilians. It also has additional cutscenes and deeper squad commanding system. I wouldn't be surprised if the PlayStation version becomes the preferred way to replay the old game just because it seems to be superior. Regardless, though, it does take a minute to get past how the game, well, looks. I can't help but imagine what this game would look like in something like Unreal Engine 5. Oh right, I think some other developers also had that same idea. We've only seen bits and pieces of the campaign for the new Hawk Ops game, but they've stressed heavily that it's a complete reimagining of the original game's missions. Visually, the trailers are incredible looking. The density of the urban environments and inclusion of a large civilian presence really gives me hopes that they're going to recapture the authenticity of this original experience. It is still kind of bizarre to me that the multiplayer and extraction mode for Hawk Ops is set in the 2030s with completely different weapons and stuff, while the campaign takes place in 1993. But regardless, you're getting that 1993 aesthetics for the campaign, so I'm quite excited about that. Now, if you're like me and you want to go back and see where things began, well, there's going to be a few roadblocks to getting the original Black Hawk Down game running. A while ago, it was delisted from online stores, so you won't be able to get an official download without resorting to a bit of Google foo. The good news is a complete installer is pretty easy to find, and if you use the DG Voodoo 2 graphics API wrapper, you can even play the game in 4K with 16:9 aspect ratio. The original game was limited to less than 1080p in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Yeah, games were different back in the day. Using DG Voodoo 2 will require a little bit of setup, but these are the settings that work best for me without causing any sorts of issues. And while that might sound like a little bit of a headache, I do think it's worth the trouble to experience this iconic game. You can tell a lot of developers took inspiration from the scale and tactical immersion of the Delta Force games. They even featured large-scale multiplayer modes, which I do remember being pretty awesome, but as far as I can tell, they're more or less unplayable given the hoops you need to jump through just to get a copy of the game up and running. But I've really enjoyed returning to one of the tactical shooter's more influential titles, and frankly I'm shocked by how well the gameplay has aged. It's really made me excited to see if Hawk Ops can carry on the Delta Force legacy in a meaningful way. Once you're able to get over these dated visuals, the dynamic missions and tight gameplay will carry you through a pretty compelling, challenging, and well-crafted tactical FPS experience. The new game certainly has some shoes to fill. I'd be curious to know if you played this game back in the day, and if so, how did it rank among your favorite titles, considering that Call of Duty and Battlefield were kind of sandwiching this game? You might have almost forgotten about it. Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave me a like, subscribe for more content like it, and ding that notification bell to beat the YouTube algorithm with me. Up next, check out my recent playthrough of the new Delta Force Hawk Ops multiplayer. It's pretty promising. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.